Greetings, everyone. My name is Tim Keyes, and welcome to God Save the King. You can listen to God Save the King every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on the Truth Be Told radio network. So all you have to do is go to www.truthbetoldnetwork.org, click on the big listen button, and you'll be listening to God Save the King on Friday nights. There's plenty of other great shows also to be found on the Truth Be Told radio network. And of course, there is a variety of ways that you can listen to all the great shows that are on Truth Be Told. You can, like I said, you can go straight to their website and click the big listen button. You can listen on your Android app. You can listen on MyTuner. You can listen on Wi-Fi radio, TuneIn radio, and of course, all the home devices, Alexa, Google, and Apple home devices. And of course, last but not least, you can actually call in on your phone. You can dial 641-741-2866 or 717-567-4977, and you can listen to the Truth Be Told radio network over your phone. So today, what I want to jump into is the chronological components of the Infancy Narratives in greater detail. Now, we started to talk about this a little bit already because one of the fundamental premises of God Save the King is that Jesus was not born on December 25th. Now, for some people, that's extremely controversial. For a lot of people, not so much. I mean, it doesn't come as a great shock to a lot of people to recognize that, okay, yeah, he wasn't born on December 25th. This is a tradition. Right? Now, I do get a lot of people, by the way, who do say, well, okay, so prove to me he wasn't. And my response to that very simply is I don't have to. You have to prove to me that he was. Okay? Because that is how evidence works. That is how the rules of evidence works, is that you have to make your case. You have to present your case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present my case for why I believe he was born on a different date. And if you believe he was born on December 25th, well, then present your case on how you think he was born on December 25th. But I got news for you saying, oh, well, that's been the accepted date for 1,000 years. That's not evidence. That's a tradition. And as we've said before, tradition is not evidence. You need evidence. And what we're going to do today is we're going to go to the Bible, okay, and look at the chronological evidence, because as I've suggested in other shows, the infancy narratives. So the infancy narratives are Matthew and Luke. Those are the only two of the four gospels that speak about Jesus's birth. Okay. You don't really have anything about his birth in Mark, and you don't really have anything about his birth in John, but you do in Matthew and in Luke. And therefore we call these the infancy narratives. Okay. And the infancy narratives of both Matthew and Luke, but especially Luke, contain more chronological information, historical chronological information, than pretty much any other section of the Bible, especially crammed into just a few chapters. That's what's really stunning about it, is in a grand total of 3 to 4 chapters, depending upon how you look at it, there is all of this chronological information. So it's actually relatively easy to start putting together the pieces of the puzzle that help us determine, okay, when was he born? In other words, if we look at the biblical and historical evidence, where do they lead us? Where do they take us? Let's start with the blank slate. Let's start with a white canvas, and then let's add the pieces of evidence one at a time and see where that leads us, instead of starting with a presumption of a certain date and then trying to either prove or disprove that. And like I said, I've said this in other places, and I put it in my writings, that this is kind of like having a jigsaw puzzle that you don't have a picture to go by, right? You've either dumped all the pieces out on the table and flipped them all over so they're upside down. You're just looking at the back of the gray cardboard, to try to put the puzzle together. Or, maybe it has a picture, but, you got the puzzle in a box with no picture on the front. So there's nothing to follow, no picture for you to look at to try to assemble the puzzle. You've got to take all the different pieces and examine each one at a time and say, oh, look, this one's got some red in it. Okay, well, here's all the red pieces over here. And ooh, this one's got a lot of blue in it. Okay, well, here's all the blue pieces over here. Oh, well, this is a border piece. Oh, cool. All right, let's start with the border. Let's put the border together. So we're doing something very, very similar to that, in that we are going to take the historical evidence that we find in the Bible, and then we're going to use that one piece at a time to start to determine, where does that lead us? Where does that direct us? Okay. And I'm going to go into some pretty reasonable detail today. So I'm not necessarily going to try to through all of it. I'm going to go into some detail, and we're going to take our time, because that's what this is all about. So, and then, as I've mentioned in other places, what we're going to do here is we're going to start with the broadest pieces of evidence, right? So we're going to start with, for example, we're going to start with the reign of Augustus Caesar. Okay, we'll use this is the first piece, right? So in Luke chapter 2, verse 1, it reads, "And it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered." Okay, well, that's real simple. This means that this decree went out, and therefore, by implication, Jesus was born during the reign of Augustus Caesar. So that means Augustus Caesar has to be alive, okay? And he has to be Caesar. He's got to be emperor at this point, okay? Because there was a big chunk of Octavian's career prior to him becoming emperor where he wasn't emperor, right? So he wasn't called Caesar at that time. He hadn't taken that family name. So let's talk about this a little bit, because some details about who Caesar was help us put this in perspective. Every one of these little details counts a little bit, because see, we say Caesar Augustus, right? Or Augustus Caesar, sometimes without realizing that is as much a title as it is a name. Okay, the man's given name was Gaius Octavius. Okay, and he was born, interesting, today's what, September 21st? Okay, well, he was born on September 23rd. No, today's the 22nd. Pardon me. Today is September 22nd, 2021. He was born on September 23rd, 63 BC. Okay, so do the math real quick. 2021 plus 63 is 2,084 years ago tomorrow is when Caesar Augustus was born. And then he died on August 19th, 14 AD. Okay. Now, he was from a very influential Roman family. His father was a senator, but his father died when he was only like 4 years old. Okay. But even though his father was a senator, it was actually his mother who had the more truly influential political connections, and that is because she was the daughter. Octavian's mother was the daughter of Julius Caesar's sister, Julia. Okay, so this would make, you got to slow down and think about that. This would make Octavian Julius Caesar's grand nephew, and make Julius Caesar Octavian's grand uncle. Okay. So unlike Octavian, see, that's, like I said, his given name is Gaius Octavius. Okay. And then we say, when we anglicize that and say it in English, we say Octavian. It's a little easier to say, right? So unlike Octavian, for Julius Caesar, Caesar was actually his name. It was his family name, his surname, or what we would call his last name, right? Now, during their lives, okay, because obviously Julius Caesar was significantly older than Octavian. During their lives, they developed a very close relationship. We don't know the precise details of what that means, but they developed a very close relationship, so close enough, actually, that Julius Caesar declared Octavian to be his adopted son and his sole heir in his will. So when Julius Caesar died, Octavian inherited everything, right? So when Julius Caesar died, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, Octavian took his adopted father's surname as his adopted son and became Octavian Caesar, right? So it started out as a family name. Okay. But over time in usage, it became more of a title, right? Now, the word Augustus is also technically a title, right? Augustus, right? August, right? Yes, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's where we get the name of the month of August, right? Julius and Augustus Caesar. That's July and August. That's where we get that, right? But the title Augustus means magnificent, and it was a title that was bestowed upon Octavian by the Roman Senate, along with exclusive sovereignty of the realm on January 16th, 27 BC, which is when he became emperor. Okay. He was the founder and first emperor of the Roman Empire. And then I won't go into great detail right now, but it's very important that we recognize that calling the Roman system the Roman Empire prior to 27 BC is not actually correct. That's the Roman Republic. Okay. That's the Roman Republic. So it changed over from being a republic to being an empire with the advent of the first emperor, which was Caesar Augustus, right? So you can see how initially Caesar was a name, but it came to be used as a title. And then, although Augustus was actually a title, because Octavian referred to himself that way and everybody else referred to him that way, that effectively became his name. He became known as Augustus Caesar or Caesar Augustus, right? When really those are kind of pretty much more titles. Now, as a result, the word Caesar became synonymous with emperor. Okay. This is 2,000 years ago. So over time, the word Caesar became synonymous with emperor or supreme leader, or frankly, dictator, with a life term in office. Okay. And we see the influence of this name in other languages. The Russian word Tsar, okay, and the German word Kaiser are derivations of the same word. And all you have to do is look at Russian or German history, and you're going to understand, where that word came from and how it works in common usage. Okay. So anyway, this is a rather broad start, but by citing the reign of Augustus in Luke chapter 2, verse 1, we now know that Jesus was born during a 40-year window between 27 BC and 14 AD. There you go. Like I said, pretty darn broad, but now we've got something to go on. So what this is, and I'm not trying to beat a dead horse here, but this means we have taken a piece of positive evidence and asked ourselves, where does this positive evidence lead us? Where does it direct us? Okay. We're not just taking a stab in the dark. We're following the evidence. Okay. So now let's look at the next piece of evidence. And the next piece of evidence, we're going to camp out here for a second, because this piece of evidence requires it, frankly. It requires us to pay attention to detail here, because there is what's the word I want to use? There's some confusion surrounding this piece of evidence. There's some conflict. There's some challenges, right? So now we're going to look at the reign of Herod the Great. And Herod the Great plays a significant role in God Save the King. And as you'll remember, that's why this teaching series is called God Save the King, why this radio show is called God Save the King, is because Herod was the Roman appointed king of Judea. Judea would have been what was known as a client kingdom. It did not become a Roman province until after Herod died. And when Herod died, he passed on his kingdom to his children, and we'll talk about this in a second, right? And it was when one of his sons, frankly, did a pretty lousy job of ruling the kingdom, that's when the Romans stepped in and said, fine, you're no longer a client kingdom, you're now a province. In other words, direct Roman rule, not indirect. So when you're a client kingdom, okay, it's indirect Roman rule, because the Romans knew better, right? They were very heavy-handed. Don't get me wrong. They were extremely heavy-handed, but they knew better than to recklessly incite rebellion amongst their subject nations, their client nations. Okay. So they knew better than to do that, right? So the smart thing to do was to appoint a king, quote unquote, in Herod the Great that at least had the appearance of being legitimate. Now, he wasn't. He was clearly a Roman appointee, and he could not be a legitimate king of Judea because he was of the wrong ethnicity. Okay, he was not a Judean. He was not a he just wasn't a Judean. Period. Right? And therefore he could not be king. He was not of the tribe of Judah. He was not, and as far as he was not a descendant of Jacob. He was a descendant of Esau. So that means he's on a whole different branch of the descendants of Abraham. He is a descendant of Abraham. Okay, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right? And then Jacob's brother is Esau, right? But he's from an entirely different branch of the descendants of Abraham. So anyway, getting ahead of myself a little bit here, let's talk about who was Herod the Great, okay? And there's a lot of backstory here, and we're not going to try to tell it all in one session of the show. We will get into the backstory because the backstory is very important and frankly super exciting. It's what puts God Save the King in its historical context. Is what was the backstory? What was going on in Judea at the time Jesus was born? So we've actually got to back up at least about 100 years and get a running start to talk about the backstory so that we know the context, the political, historical context of when Jesus was born. So Herod the Great was the second son of Antipater the Idumean. Now, Antipater was a high-ranking official in the court of Ethnarch Hyrcanus II of Judea. Now, what the heck does all that mean? We're going to talk about that in another session, okay? But let me repeat it for those of you that want to, go dive in and chase this down. Herod the Great was the second son of Antipater the Idumean. Antipater was a high-ranking official in the court of Judean Ethnarch Hyrcanus II. Okay? Now, Antipater was an Idumean, right? So in other words, he's an Edomite. He is a descendant of Esau. And then Antipater's wife her name was Cypros, and Cypros was a Nabatean, or frankly, what we would call today an Arab. Okay? A Nabatean Arab, which means Herod did not have a drop of Judean blood in his system, which means he could not be a legitimate king of Judea, of Israel. That required to be of the tribe of Judah in general and of the house of David in particular, right? Now, the precise date of Herod's birth is contested, all right? So most scholars place it in either 74 or 73 BC, but some scholars place it as late as 72 or even 71, right? Now, also the date of his death is contested, and that is a central feature of this thesis. The fact that the date of his death is contested. And so when was it? When did Herod die? Because we started with our first piece of evidence that Jesus was born during the reign of Augustus Caesar. Now we're adding our second piece of evidence. He was born during the reign of Herod the Great. And what we can do is we can take these, even though they're still pretty darn broad, if we take these two pieces of evidence and see where they overlap, okay, well, now we've got a smaller window to look at, right? Because as I said, Augustus Caesar, that's 40 years. Okay, that's pretty big. Well, we can eliminate some pretty big chunks of that pretty quickly, right? Now, Herod Jesus was born during the reign, okay, not during the lifetime necessarily, although that is a piece of the puzzle, right? But he was born during the reign of Herod the Great. Okay. Now Herod reigned as king of Judea from 37 BC until his death in 1 BC. Now, that is the corrected date. Now, here's the funny thing. You can actually go to Wikipedia, of all places, right? Not known as being the greatest source of accurate information, right? Okay. But you can go to Wikipedia, of all places, and read this. Most scholarship concerning the date of Herod's death follows Emil Schurer's calculations. And we're going to talk about who Emil Schurer was here in a minute, right? But it reads, most scholarship, I'm reading directly from Wikipedia, right? Most scholars concerning the date of Herod's death follow Emil Schurer's calculations. But check this out, which revised a traditional death date of 1 BC to 4 BC. So in other words, prior to this cat named as Emil Schurer, right, who is a German theologian who lived in the 19th century, okay, predominant in the 19th century, until then, the accepted date of Herod's death was 1 BC. Okay? Now, if Schurer's research was accurate, well, okay, fair enough. Because if they had it wrong up until then, and now we can correct it by using Schurer's investigation and his evidence, okay, well, great, cool. Show me the evidence and let's make a decision. Let's look at the evidence together and find out what we're talking about here, okay? But to put this in perspective, this is a list of church fathers, of early church fathers that all believed that Herod died in 1 BC. So this means from about 100 AD until about 1900 AD, roughly 1800 years, everybody believed that Herod died in 1 BC. Okay, come on. 1800 years, everybody believed he died in 1 BC. And then all of a sudden, one guy comes along and says, oh, no, it was 4 BC. Okay, now, like I said, all right, if you've got the evidence to back it up, good. But if you don't, okay, you're beating your head against a wall, right? So here is a list of early church fathers that all believed that Herod died in 1 BC. Irenaeus, right? Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Africanus, Hippolytus of Rome, Hippolytus of Thebes, Origen, Eusebius, and Epiphanius, okay, all believed, and that is the source, by the way. I don't think I have it here on my shelf. Let me check real quick. I'm going to go off camera, okay, and look on my bookshelf and see if I have this book right here. And if I do, I'll show it to you. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. You know, that's breaking the rules. You're not supposed to go off camera like that. So anyway, what I'll do is I'll grab it off my bookshelf and I'll show it to you on a different show. But it's a book written by a scholar named Jack Finnegan, and it's called The Handbook of Biblical Chronology. Okay. Now, Jack Finnegan worked. I'm getting off topic a little bit, right? But Jack Finnegan worked hand in hand with. His name escapes me. I'll have to look it up. But he worked hand in hand during the 1970s and 1980s when a lot of this breakthrough research was being done. He worked hand in hand with the it's the observatory, Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, right? Because they were putting on and the book I mentioned last week, Ernest Martin, right? The birth of Jesus Christ recalculated, the star that astonished the world. So Ernest Martin, Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, okay, and then Jack Finnegan, they all worked hand in hand on this really, really, really breakthrough chronological information. Now they were going mostly off of the stars, and we're going to get to a different celestial indicator here in a second, an eclipse. Okay, because that's one of the great things about the astronomy feature of this story, and part of what it makes so fascinating is because astronomy is a cosmic clock, and you can wind the clock backwards and go, oh, look at that, there it is on that date right there. Okay, now we have to express those dates in a calendar that we understand, and when you start having to transpose calendars from one to another, it starts becoming a real mess. So when you've got to transpose the Roman calendar, the Julian calendar into the Jewish calendar, and then the Jewish calendar in the Gregorian calendar, and try to cross-reference them, I mean, it can be a real mess. But the good news is, as at least according to the calendar as we understand it, by using celestial indicators, you can go, oh, look, bang, there it is. It's this date, right? According to our understanding, but it's this date, right? Okay, so now I've been throwing a bunch of information out there. Let's kind of try to get this together and why this matters, right? Because we started with the reign of Augustus Caesar, a 40-year window, 27 BC to 14 AD, right? Now we are adding the reign of Herod the Great. Now, Herod reigned from 37 BC until his death in 1 BC. So what we can do now is we can throw out the 10 years from 37 to 27 BC, and we can throw out the 14 or 15 years from 1 BC to 14 AD. We can throw those out. And now we can focus on a 26-year period of time between 27 BC and 1 BC. Okay, so we're chopping this down, and we just took off some big chunks, 10 years and 15 years off either end, right? Because Augustus had to be alive and Herod had to be alive. Now that's very important because Herod had to be alive. He had to be alive not only when Jesus was born, but Herod also had to be alive when the Magi visited, right? Because scripture tells us very directly that he interacted with the Magi. And one of the other pieces of our puzzle is the fact that, you know, the traditional nativity set, sorry guys, the traditional nativity set is incorrect. The Magi and the shepherds were not there at the same time. The Magi did not arrive the night of Jesus' birth. We are told very clearly in scripture that that was not the case. We are told that the shepherds found a baby lying in a manger, but that the Magi found a young child living in a house. Two very different statements, two very different ideas. And as we put the chronological pieces together, we're going to discover that that's about 15 months apart. Okay, that that Jesus was born in September of 3 BC, and that the Magi arrived at the court of Herod the Great, frankly, in December of 2 BC, right? And so how do we know that, right? How do we know that, okay? Because Herod had to be alive not only for when Jesus was born, but when the Magi arrived. If Herod is dead, then we can eliminate that from consideration. And see, and here's the problem. You have to kind of imagine a timeline in your head, right? When Emil Schurer, quote unquote, corrected the date of Herod's death and changed it from the accepted date of 1 BC to 4 BC in the late 19th century, his research was pretty much universally accepted for about the next 60 years. Okay, and no one challenged it. No one touched it. It wasn't until about the mid 1960s that a couple of scholars started going, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. All these other cats, you know, the list of early church fathers I mentioned, Irenaeus, Clement, Tertullian, Hippolytus, Origen, etc., they all believed that Herod died in 1 BC. So where the heck does Schurer get this idea that he was born in 4 BC? Now, who was Emil Schurer, right? Emil Schurer was a very eminent German theologian who taught and wrote in the late 19th and early 20th century, okay? So and the work of his that I'm referring to is his magnum opus, right? I won't try to pronounce it in German. I took a couple of years in German in high school, but my German stinks, so I'm not going to try to impress you by pronouncing it in German. In English, it is translated A History of the Jewish People in the Time of Jesus Christ. And it was initially published in 1890. Okay. So the version I have, I won't grab it off my bookshelf. It's not close. It's 5 volumes, right? But the version I have is a reprint of the original 1890 edition. There were additional editions published subsequently to that, but I have a copy of the a reprint of the 1890 edition. Okay. But it was in this book, okay, in this volume of books by Emil Schurer that he said, whoop, no, not 1 BC, it's 4 BC. And then that, like I said, was pretty much universally accepted and unchallenged for about 60 years. And it is in Bible dictionaries, Bible encyclopedias, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it is something that I run into continually in this work is scholars who they're totally unaware that that date, in my opinion, is straight up false, right? But at the very least is strongly contested. I mean, strongly contested. You can't put it in too strong a language. That it's very, very, very challengeable, right? And it's amazing how many people just want to go, oh no, nope, it's 4 BC, right? And they won't even consider the possibility. But here's the problem with that. We've got all these other chronological indicators, right? And if we get to them today, we'll talk about them today. But we've got all these other chronological indicators. We've got the governorship of Quirinius, okay? Now, if we don't get to that today, fine, because we need to go into detail about that, the governorship of Quirinius. And we need to talk about the events that needed to occur between Jesus's birth and Herod's death, because the Bible tells us about all these different things that had to happen. So that's another reason we know that there was a pretty decent chunk of time between when Jesus was born and when Herod died. It wasn't a matter of a few weeks. It was a matter of a bunch of months and maybe even a year or more, which is, in my opinion, is what it was. It would have been around 16 months between when Jesus was born and when Herod died. So that makes sense that there's all these different chronological things that had to happen in that time period, right? And then there's Herod's margin for error. Why did Herod, after meeting with the Magi, kill every male child in and around Bethlehem 2 years and younger? Even if he added a margin for error, even if he added a little bit, which I think is what he did, right? I think the Magi's information given to Herod was pretty darn accurate, so that Herod could have, pretty much pinpointed, hey, you're looking for a toddler about 15 months old, right? Well, let's add 6 months to that. And frankly, let's add 9 months to that. Let's make it 2 years, right? So that we're going to make sure we're going to get him, in Herod's thinking, right? And then you've got another reference to the reign of Tiberius Caesar. You've got Caesar's registration. You've got the course of Abijah, which is when John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, was ministering in the temple. That's another chronological indicator. So these all help us narrow the field. Okay, so this is a lot of information. Let's try to summarize a little bit, because if we accept Emil Schurer's revised date, not the accepted date, right? And we have to be careful not to call it the traditional date, okay? Because it wasn't tradition, okay, that Herod died in 1 BC. This was historical research by the church fathers, okay, that suggested he died in 1 BC. So that was the accepted date. That was the historically accepted date among theologians, right, and scholars until Emil Schurer, right? But if you accept Emil Schurer's revised date, then when you start to look at all of these other chronological indicators that I just mentioned, right? The registration, for example, or if you start to try to examine the astronomy, right? What possibly could the Magi have seen? But you're limiting your scope. You're saying, but we're only going to look earlier than 4 BC, right? We're only going to look earlier than 4 BC. Well, now you've got a real problem, because now if something doesn't seem to fit, there's the temptation to try to make it fit, okay? Because you're convinced that Herod died in 4 BC. But if you know the real date as 1 BC, that adds an additional 3-year window that you can look at now, right? And if we look at that window, okay, and say, oh, what was the course of Abijah during these 3 years? Oh, was there a decree issued by Augustus Caesar during these 3 years? Oh, right. Now this changes things dramatically. Okay, because now when we start looking at these chronological indicators in this time window, guess what? We don't have to force them. They start dropping into place very conveniently, very easily, okay? So now why, here's the big question then. So let's get to the $64,000 question. Why did Emil Schurer revise the date? What was his evidence? Why did he do that, right? Well, the reason he did that is because Herod's death, okay, is understood to have occurred very shortly after a lunar eclipse, okay? That's extremely important here. Herod's death is understood to have happened very shortly after a lunar eclipse. And the lunar eclipse in view here is mentioned by the historian Josephus. Okay, so that is very important, okay? So now this is in Josephus, his Antiquity of the Jews, okay? It's in book number 17, chapter 6, verse 4, okay? I won't tell you a whole lot about the backstory. I'll try to keep that to a minimum right now. But there was a lot going on. There was a rebellion. There was a plot against Herod's life, right? And then in Antiquity of the Jews, book 17, chapter 6, verse 4, we read, "But Herod deprived this Matthias of the high priesthood and burnt the other Matthias." See, there's two guys named Matthias, right? So Josephus is differentiating between the two. "But Herod deprived this Matthias of the high priesthood and burnt the other Matthias, who had raised the sedition with his companions alive." Okay, so Herod defrocked one Matthias of the high priesthood, and then this other Matthias and his companions who had engaged in sedition, he burned them alive. Okay, and this is Herod. This is Herod. Okay, he is an extraordinarily cruel individual, right? So he executed these men, and then it reads, "And that very night there was an eclipse of the moon." Okay, so Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, book 17, chapter 6, verse 4. "But Herod deprived this Matthias of the high priesthood and burnt the other Matthias, who had raised the sedition with his companions, alive. And that very night there was an eclipse of the moon." Okay, now important note here: ancient historians, Josephus among them, they did not tend to record dates. Okay, today when we do historical research, it's common practice to say, "Oh, we discovered this on September 22nd, 2001, right? And then we verify what we're doing. They didn't do it that way. They had a very, what we would consider odd way of referencing their material. They didn't cite dates. They would cite notable events, right? So like all through the works of Josephus, you'll find him saying, and such happened, and it was near the festival. Okay, and then that's all they say, right? Because what they're assuming is that the reader knows which festival they're talking about. They weren't assuming that we'd be reading this 2,000 years later and that we don't know which festival they're speaking of or what year they're speaking of or whatever. But thank God he mentions an eclipse of the moon, because now with modern computers and software, we can go back and look, okay, this was a lunar eclipse that was visible in Judea, okay? So now we can get out our computer astronomy software and say, okay, how many eclipses were there visible from Judea in this general time frame, right? And of course, we can add or subtract, 2, 3, 5, 7 years, 10 years if we want, to make sure we are looking at all possible variants, right? And then examining them, cross-referencing them. That's the whole point here. We cross-reference them with the other evidence and say, does that line up? Does that make sense, right? So when we consider that, right, now, if we need to look at eclipses in that general time frame, this is what we discover, is that there was only a small handful of eclipses that would have qualified. There's only like 4, period, that even are worth mentioning, right? And then of the 4, there's actually only 2 that are worth really investigating, right? And the 2 that are worth investigating are, there was a lunar eclipse on March 13th of 4 BC, all right? So that is rather clearly the one that Schurer focused in on, but there's also a lunar eclipse on January 9th of 1 BC, okay? And here's the deal. Schurer either wasn't aware of that one, and that's a distinct possibility, or he rejected it, okay? And I would have to do a little further research to know which that is. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. And since we are talking about following the evidence where the evidence leads, I'm not going to conjecture other than saying, okay, he either wasn't aware that there was a 1 BC option, right? Which that's entirely possible. He might not have been aware that there was a 1 BC option, or he did consider the 1 BC option and rejected it for some reason, okay? But here's the key. Also in Josephus, okay, because see, we were talking about the record in Josephus where it says, okay, so here's the death, or pardon me, here's the eclipse, okay? Herod executes these guys, these 2 men named Matthias plus some of their companions, right? He defrocks one, he executes the other, okay? Let's be accurate. And that very night that he did that, there's an eclipse of the moon, right? Now, that's in Antiquities of the Jews, book 17, chapter 6, verse 4. Then in book 17, chapter 7, verse 1, okay, is when Herod executes one of his sons. One of his sons had engaged in a plot to murder him, to murder Herod, and Herod discovered it, okay? So that's his son Antipater, right? So the son of Herod, Antipater, engaged in a plot to murder Herod. Herod discovered it, and he throws Antipater in prison, but now he has to get permission from Rome to execute Antipater, right? Okay. So this is another piece of the puzzle, Okay, this is another piece of the puzzle, is because he executes, because then if we jump forward to Antiquities, book 17, chapter 8, verse 5, we read, when he had done these things, he died the 5th day after he had caused Antipater to be slain. Okay, so now see, we have these pieces of the puzzle, right? We know that Herod's son Antipater engaged in a plot to murder his father Herod. Herod discovered the plot. Okay, now roughly coincidental with that, he defrocks one Matthias and burns the other Matthias alive. Okay, that night there is a eclipse of the moon. Now Herod is waiting for the answer from Rome that he can execute Antipater, right? Which he gets. He gets permission. He executes Antipater, and then he dies 5 days later. Then there is this big list of events listed by Josephus that takes place between Herod's death and Passover of the same year. And that is a critical component, because it is a long list of other historical events that occurred between Herod's death and Passover. Okay, so look at the sequence here. Eclipse, executes Antipater, dies, big chunk of time, Passover. Okay, again, eclipse, executes Antipater, dies, big chunk of time, Passover. So that means the chunk of time between the eclipse and Passover, let alone between Herod's death and Passover, has to be a large enough amount of time for all these events to have taken place. So the question before us becomes very simply, how much time was there between the eclipse in 4 BC and Passover of the same year, and how much time was there between the eclipse in 1 BC and Passover the same year, and therefore which one fits the criteria better? Okay, because now we're going to talk dates, because see, we know, because of astronomy software, we know the date, and the Hebrew calendar, the Hebrew religious calendar, is a lunar calendar, so that we know, see here, it's real easy. We know that Passover each year occurs on the first full moon after the vernal equinox. The first full moon after the vernal equinox, after the spring equinox, right? Now, take note, an eclipse of the moon can also only occur on a full moon, right? So we're looking at two sets of parameters, two sets of dates here, one in 4 BC, one in 1 BC, eclipse and Passover in 4 BC, eclipse and Passover in 1 BC, and how much time is in between to cram in all these things that had to happen between these two dates. Okay, so in 4 BC, the traditional choice, this is problematic because the eclipse that year was on March 13th, but Passover was on April 11th. Okay, so that is, I can't do the math quickly off the top of my head. What is that, 28 days, right? Oh my God, 29 days. It had, see, I just figured it out as I said it, right? They both had to be full moons. So it's from full moon to full moon, because you have to have a lunar eclipse on a full moon, right? So that's the full moon on March 13th. The next full moon is April 11th, 29 days later. Okay, there it is. You got 29 days to fit all this stuff in. And very simply, it's not enough. 29 days is not enough for Herod to, because Herod was really sick at this time, and he would go get mineral treatments at a town called Calirho, which was on the opposite side of the Dead Sea. See, the Dead Sea is just full of minerals, right? So he would go to these hot baths and get these mineral treatments in Calirho for his illness, right? So that was one of the things he did, is he traveled to Calirho and back, right? That was one of the things that happened. And then he gets word from Rome, and then he executes Antipater, and then he dies 5 days later. And then there's his funeral procession and all this other stuff that had to happen before Passover, right? And it just simply isn't enough time in 4 BC. It's not enough. So what about 1 BC? Okay. Well, in 1 BC, the lunar eclipse occurred on January 9th. Okay. Passover of that year occurred on April 8th. So do the math. January, February, March, April. Okay. 90 days or 87 days, right? 87 days. That's perfect. Okay. It is long enough, but not too long, right? If we look at a couple of the other lunar eclipses that are a little too far outside this time frame to truly be considered, one of the other challenges is that one of them is just way too much time. It's way too much time, because Joseph mentions that all these events that occurred between Herod's death and Passover were done in haste. In other words, they did them quickly to get them done before Passover. Okay, so quick summary. I mean, we only made it through 2 pieces of evidence here, but one of them was an extraordinarily important piece of evidence. We know that Jesus was born during the reign of Augustus Caesar, 27 BC to 14 AD. We know he was born during the reign of Herod the Great, 37 BC to 1 BC, not 4 BC, 1 BC. So we take those 2 chunks, that 10-year chunk at the beginning and that 15-year chunk on the end, and we can throw those away. We now know that Jesus was born between 27 BC and 1 BC. And frankly, we can jump way ahead. We can fast forward significantly and recognize that he was born within a few years of Herod dying. All right. Because, he's like, we already know. See, we could actually jump forward right now. We won't do it today. We're going to save it for the next session. But we could jump forward to Herod's margin of error for the slaughter of the innocents, right? Herod, because if the Magi visited Herod right before he died, within a couple of months before he died, and then Herod's margin of error was 2 years, then you're looking at a maximum of about 2.5 years prior to Herod's death is when Jesus could have been born, right? So now this doesn't address the issue of December 25th directly, but it does help us address what year was he was born. And now as we continue to look at these other pieces of evidence, we're going to narrow the field and narrow the field and narrow the field and narrow the field. And that will help us focus in not just on what year he was born, but what month was he born, and then what day was he born. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up there. This is Tim Keyes with GodSaveTheKing.org, broadcasting on the Truth Be Told radio network. And just a quick little bit of business as we wrap up today. Always remember that the views expressed on God Save the King are my views. They're not necessarily the views of the Truth Be Told radio network. And you can, of course, watch the Truth Be Told radio network, or listen to the Truth Be Told radio network at their website, truthbetoldnetwork.org. Click on the big listen button. And of course, on the Android app, MyTuner, Wi-Fi radio, TuneIn radio, Alexa, Google, and Apple home devices. And of course, dial in at 641-741-2866 or 717-567-4977 to listen to the Truth Be Told radio network. This is Tim Keyes of GodSaveTheKing.org signing off. We hope you have a blessed day, and we hope you enjoyed our information. We'll be back for more next week, every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. Have a great day.